Hello and welcome back to another episode of Indistinct Chatter. I'm Eliza, and before we get into today's topic, let's talk about the headlines that have been dominating the news cycle over the past few days. Because honestly, things are still tense and they are definitely nonstop. One story has really been driving everything else, and it's something I mentioned last week and the week before, and I'm sure I'll mention again: escalating conflict between Israel and Iran. And this week, it's escalated in a way that's a lot harder to ignore, okay? We are now seeing direct strikes hitting energy infrastructure, which is a big deal, not just for the region, but globally. The US has responded by increasing its military presence in the region and warning about potential spillover, especially involving shipping routes and oil supply chains. So when you hear Middle East conflict, what that actually means for people here in the US is higher gas prices, more pressure on inflation, and a lot of uncertainty in the markets. Because this isn't just about geopolitics, it's about economics too. Like I mentioned in previous episodes, oil prices have been climbing fast, and whenever that happens, the conversation immediately shifts to inflation. So now you've got governments, economists, and markets all reacting at once. So stocks have been shaky, investors are nervous, and there's a growing sense that things could get more expensive again. So that's been the core story tying a lot of headlines together this week: conflict, energy, and money. Meanwhile, over in science and space news, and you know how I feel about space, NASA has been making moves, literally. The Artemis 2 rocket has officially been rolled out as part of launch prep, and this mission is a big one, okay? It is set to be the first crewed mission around the moon since the Apollo era. The crew includes 3 NASA astronauts and 1 Canadian astronaut, Jeremy Hansen of the Canadian Space Agency, making it the first time a non-American will be part of a lunar mission. Serving as a mission specialist and the first woman assigned to a lunar mission, Christina Koch, who's a NASA electrical engineer and holds the record for the longest continuous spaceflight by a woman, just a cool, casual 328 days. And the pilot for this mission is Victor Glover, who is the first Black astronaut assigned to a mission orbiting the moon. Victor is a NASA astronaut and U.S. Navy captain who previously spent 6 months on the International Space Station. These are some pretty major milestones, if you ask me. And as much as space freaks me out, this is pretty cool. It feels kind of maybe nostalgic, if that makes sense. Like, I feel like I'm watching a movie from the 70s. I'm just glad that while everything here on Earth is so chaotic, humanity is still aiming for the moon. Eh? Back here on Earth, weather has also been making headlines, but in a very different way. It's not exactly giving hopeful, nostalgic vibes. Part of the US did get a rare chance to see the northern lights again this week, though, which I feel like I only ever hear about after the fact. But beyond that, the bigger story is just how extreme and varied the weather has been across the country. In the past week alone, we have seen a massive blizzard system that hit multiple regions with snow, ice, and power outages, severe storms bringing tornado risks across the south, and continued fire weather warnings out west, including here in Colorado. There's also been some international health news that's getting attention: a meningitis outbreak in the UK. Right now, it's been concentrated among younger populations, particularly students, with dozens of confirmed cases and multiple deaths. And the reason this is being so closely watched isn't necessarily because it's spreading globally or anything. It's more so because meningitis can move quickly in close contact environments like schools and universities. So the concern is less about widespread transmission and more about how fast it can escalate in specific communities, which is why public health officials are paying attention to it. So definitely not trying to, fearmonger or give you flashbacks to 2020. This is just something health officials are watching, and, we should all be aware of things that can spread quickly, in my opinion. Now, shifting to entertainment, because there actually has been a major story here. The Bachelorette made headlines after ABC abruptly canceled its upcoming season just days before it was supposed to premiere. And the reason why is tied directly to its Bachelorette, Taylor Frankie Paul. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because she's also connected to The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, which follows a group of Mormon influencers aka Mom Talk, whose personal lives and their scandals have played out very publicly online. Taylor Frankie Paul was at the center of that world. She went viral during the Mom Talk scandal after revealing that she was part of a soft swinging friend group. And that alone brought a ton of attention to Mom Talk. But what really escalated things was her later involvement in a domestic violence case that led to charges and a very public fallout, something that was already part of her storyline on The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. ABC knew about that history when casting her. That wasn't new information. What changed this week is that the controversy resurfaced in a much bigger way with a video. Also, the finale of the newest season of Secret Lives sparked a lot of backlash. And instead of trying to manage it, ABC just pulled the entire season. And that's pretty unusual. Reality shows almost never get scrapped once they're fully filmed. They find a way, you know? So this isn't just about one person. I think it's more so raising bigger questions about how far networks are willing to go with controversial casting before it stops being drama and starts being about liability. You know, this was the first reality star to be the Bachelorette. It's, you know, kind of a dying franchise in my opinion and a lot of people's opinions, to be honest. And I think they were really trying to get something buzzworthy going. This is still so ongoing and it involves domestic violence, possible alleged child abuse. So it's really sad. It's ongoing. I don't want to speak too much on it because I don't really know the ins. Obviously, we don't know what's going on behind closed doors, but it's crazy. And at the same time that that's going on, we kind of have a completely different kind of entertainment headline cycle that's happening, one that is more nostalgia driven. Miley Cyrus has been everywhere. She is celebrating 20 years of Hannah Montana with a full anniversary push that includes appearances, throwback visuals, and a special that is expected to bring even more nostalgia with former cast interviews. There's also been some crossover with the podcast culture. Call Her Daddy host Alex Cooper has been part of the conversation. She is helping bring that Disney era nostalgia into a more adult, current audience with a sit down. So I'm really excited for that as well. Honestly, it's this like interesting full circle moment where something that defined a generation is now being repackaged for the same audience, just older. And honestly, people are eating it up. A lot of shows have tried this and it either hits or flops, you know? So I'm excited to see how this one lands. So overall, the tone of this past week's headlines, I'd say they're a mix of high stakes global tension, economic anxiety, and then on the entertainment side, there's controversy, nostalgia, and just enough distraction to kind of keep people scrolling. Now, before we move on, let's talk about a few headlines that didn't dominate the cycle, but in my opinion, are important. At the state level, there's been real measurable movement around laws that directly impact women's healthcare and reproductive rights, and it's happening right now. Not just in talks, not down the road, right now. In states like Texas and Idaho, lawmakers and courts are continuing to push and defend restrictions on medication abortion, specifically the use of mifepristone. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. This is a big deal, though, because the drug now accounts for more than half of all abortions in the US. Some of the policies being advanced would ban telehealth prescriptions entirely. That means patients would have to physically travel to a provider, which is a massive barrier in states where clinics are already scarce. Others are even trying to extend legal risk to doctors who prescribe across state lines, which could open up a whole world of criminal or civil penalties, even if the doctor is in a state where it is totally legal. This is all part of the patchwork system created by Dobbs versus Jackson, where your basic legal rights to medical care now depend almost entirely on your zip code. In some states, you're looking at restrictions after just 6 weeks. That's a point where many people don't even know that they're pregnant yet, while in others, those same rights are fully protected. At the same time, all this is going down, we are seeing a major disruption in how we travel. Right now, the TSA is facing a massive staffing crisis due to a partial government shutdown and a funding lapse that has left many agents working without pay. Because of this, we're seeing record wait times and reports of agents quitting or calling out sick at airports across the country. This is leading to some very interesting conspiracy theories, just a little FYI, and it's cause for concern if you ask me. In a highly controversial move to address the shortages, ICE agents have been deployed to several major airports like Newark, Atlanta, and Chicago to help with crowd control and security checkpoints. It's a move that has sparked a lot of debate as critics argue that ICE agents aren't trained for airport security, while others see it as a necessary stopgap. Either way, it's a visible shift in how federal law is being applied on the ground, at our borders, and in our terminals. Speaking of things on the ground, environmental policy is also becoming a much louder conversation. I mentioned it earlier, just this past week, the massive storm systems that brought blizzards and power outages to the Midwest, the South dealing with tornadoes, the West, including Colorado, dealing with repeated red flag warnings because of that dangerous mix of dry air and high winds, as well as this heat dome that we're under. Again, it's only March and we've already hit 90 degrees. What's interesting, though, is that this isn't just weather anymore, it's turning into policy pressure. States like California and Colorado are pouring money into wildfire mitigation while others are facing heat for not upgrading their power grids or infrastructure fast enough. Again, we are asking our policymakers important questions like who pays when homes are destroyed and are our communities actually ready for this? On a much lighter note, the US Mint is continuing its rollout of redesigned coins through the American Women Quarters program. Now, I thought retiring the penny meant that the other coins would kind of soon follow, but maybe not. We've already seen icons like Maya Angelou and Eleanor Roosevelt on the quarter, and now there's a real push to expand that representation to other currency, like the dime, which hasn't seen a major redesign in decades. The Mint just unveiled the 2026 Emerging Liberty Dime for the country's 250th anniversary, and it's already sparking a ton of controversy. It features Lady Liberty on the front, but the back shows an eagle clutching arrows in one talon while the other talon is completely empty. What's missing, you may be wondering? Well, just the olive branch, the symbol of peace. Critics say it looks way too aggressive, like we're choosing war over peace. The artist says it was intentional, meant to show the colonists fighting for freedom before they actually reached peace. I mean, I guess it makes a statement, and it's a small change, sure, but I don't know, it's kind of a telling story, wouldn't you say? To me, I'm reading it as like it's about who and what we choose to recognize in our everyday life. So if we're getting rid of peace, a symbol for peace, what does that say? And all of that, or most of that, actually ties into today's episode. Because when we look at things like these new state level healthcare restrictions or TSA deployments, we see that the law doesn't always treat us the same. Because it's still Women's History Month, we're going to be diving into laws that apply to women and not men, and how they show up in ways you might not expect. So, with that, let's get into today's episode. When looking at the history of laws in the US, many of the most restrictive rules for women were based on the legal concept of coverture. Coverture sounds like an old-fashioned term, but it's actually the foundation of how our legal system viewed women for centuries. Essentially, coverture meant that when a woman married, her legal identity was absorbed by her husband. She was considered to be under not only his protection, but also his total authority. In the eyes of the law, the two people became one person, and that one person was the husband. To give you an idea of how that actually looked, under coverture, a married woman couldn't own property in her own name, sign a contract, or even keep the wages she earned from a job. Everything legally belonged to her husband. But it went even deeper than just money. Because she didn't technically exist as a separate legal person, she had no rights to her own children, even if she left the marriage, and she couldn't even sue someone in court without her husband's permission. It was a system built on the idea that women weren't capable of legal independence. And while we've spent the last 150 years or so dismantling those laws, starting with things like the Married Women's Property Acts in the 1800s, the logic of coverture still lingers in our systems today. It's the ancestor of things like the pink tax, or the fact that until 1974, a woman couldn't get a credit card without a man's signature. It's why we're still fighting for things like the Equal Rights Amendment, because the legal default in this country was male only for a very, very long time. So, to really understand how coverture worked, we have to look at its roots. Coverture was a holdover from English common law brought over to the American colonies in the late 1600s. There's a famous quote from a legal scholar named William Blackstone that sums it up pretty perfectly. Quote, "By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. The very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended." End quote. Yuck. This stayed the status quo until the mid 1800s. The first real crack in the system happened in 1848 when New York passed the Married Women's Property Act. It was the first time a married woman could legally keep her own inheritance or property. By 1900, every state had followed suit, finally giving women the right to own property and keep their own wages. But even after women could own property, the logic of coverture didn't just vanish. Instead, it moved into other areas of life, creating laws that honestly sound absolutely wild to us today. First up being the right to jury duty. For a long time, women were actually excluded from juries because the law assumed their place was at home, or that they were too delicate for the courtroom. Some states even had laws where women only served if they opted in by specifically signing up, while men were automatically called. This wasn't fully fixed until 1975 when the Supreme Court ruled in Taylor v. Louisiana that excluding women from juries violated the Constitution. Today, women often make up a significant portion and sometimes the majority of reporting jurors. All female juries, once a legal impossibility, are now entirely legal and have occurred in high-profile cases. And to the point of saying that we're too delicate, well, data suggests the opposite. Women are often seen as more punitive or decisive in specific legal scenarios. Research indicates that having women on a jury can significantly increase conviction rates for sex offenses by as much as 16 percentage points. Mock jury studies have shown that female jurors often report higher confidence in guilty verdicts compared to their male counterparts, regardless of the defendant's gender, and some legal experts argue that women are more meticulous at building their cases and laying out facts, a tactic that is increasingly successful in modern show-me trials where jurors demand hard proof. You want receipts? Bitch, we've got them. Also, a meta-analysis of over 380 experiments found that men were 4% more deceptive than women, which challenges the old ways of presenting women as less reliable or more easily swayed in a courtroom. Next, we have the head and master laws. Until 1981, Louisiana had a law called the head and master rule. It gave a husband the unilateral right to sell the family home or take out a mortgage on it without his wife's knowledge or consent, even if both of their names were on the title. It took a Supreme Court case, Kirchberg versus Feenstra, to finally strike that down as unconstitutional. The court ruled 9-0 that this law violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment because it discriminated based on gender without an exceedingly persuasive justification. In 1974, Harold Feenstra was incarcerated on charges of molesting his daughter. To pay his attorney, Carl Kirkbarg, Harold mortgaged the family home without his wife Joan's knowledge or consent. Under Louisiana Civil Code Article 2404, the husband was deemed the head and master of community property, allowing him to alienate or mortgage shared assets unilaterally. Joan Feenstra only learned of the mortgage in 1976 when Carl threatened to foreclose on her home. She then filed a counterclaim challenging the constitutionality of the state's property laws. Justice Thurgood Marshall delivered the majority opinion on March 23, 1981, affirming that gender-based classifications must serve an important governmental interest to be constitutional. Carl argued that Joan could have filed a declaration by authentic act to protect her property, but the court rejected this, stating that the absence of an insurmountable barrier does not excuse a law that is inherently discriminatory. The mortgage on the Feenstra home was invalidated, and the state's head and master provisions were officially declared unconstitutional. The case effectively ended the last legal remnants of the head and master rule in the U.S., which had historically treated women as legally subordinate to their husbands in property matters. During the litigation, the Louisiana legislature revised its codes to grant spouses equal control over community property, But the court's ruling was necessary to address existing mortgages like the one in the Feenstra case. The case was famously cited by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg during oral arguments for Obergefell versus Hodges to illustrate how traditional legal concepts of marriage have evolved toward equality. Then there are the historical domicile laws. In many parts of the US, well into the 20th century, a woman's legal domicile, or her legal home address, was automatically considered to be wherever her husband lived. So this wasn't just a formality. This meant that if she wanted to live elsewhere, let's say for work or school, she could lose her right to vote in her own district or even face legal trouble for desertion of her domestic duties. A woman often wasn't allowed to leave the family home without her husband's consent unless she could prove a legally sufficient reason, like extreme physical cruelty. So even if she left for something like an education or a job, the consequences could be severe. Under the law, a husband could be legally released from any obligation to provide her food, shelter, or financial support if his wife, quote unquote, deserted him. He could even post a notice in the newspaper called a renunciation, essentially cutting her off from the economy by telling merchants that he wouldn't be responsible for her debts. Now, keep in mind, since she wasn't allowed to keep her own income for a long time, this was a way to make her completely destitute. And it affected her children, too. Under the tender years doctrine, mothers often got custody of their young kids, but if a woman was found guilty of willful desertion, she was frequently deemed an unfit parent. In many states, the husband was granted sole custody as the default legal guardian. And even as divorce became more common, a woman found at fault for desertion was often legally barred from receiving alimony, regardless of how many years she had contributed to the household. In extreme cases, a husband could even seek a court order for the restitution of conjugal rights. While the U.S. rarely jailed women for refusing to return, the legal and social pressure acted as a powerful legal cage, leaving many women with no choice but to stay. These laws were largely dismantled by the no-fault divorce revolution that started in California in 1969. By the mid-'80s, every state allowed people to end a marriage without needing to prove desertion or fault. That's not that long ago, mind you. Also, not that long ago, the Supreme Court effectively killed the remaining husband as boss rules in the 70s and 80s, thanks to Kirkbride versus Feenstra in 1981. And while digging for this episode, I found that although these laws are gone, there is a version of them that still lives on in the civil court. It's called loss of consortium. Today, it's more gender neutral, but basically, if one spouse is injured, the other can sue for the loss of companionship. So back then it was if your wife was injured, you, the husband, could sue her. Well, it's crazy. Now either party can do it, which is still crazy. So I guess even if you have good insurance, I guess try not to get injured or your spouse can sue you, maybe allegedly. But if you want to talk about a law that sounds truly unbelievable today, I have to talk about spousal rape. For most of U.S. history, it was legally impossible for a man to be charged with raping his wife. This went back to that same idea of coverture. The legal theory was that by getting married, a woman gave her irrevocable consent to her husband. Essentially, the law viewed sex as a marital right for the husband and a duty for the wife. What's truly wild, though, is how long this lasted. It wasn't until 1976 that Nebraska became the first state to fully criminalize marital rape. Before that, every single state had some form of marital exemption written into their rape laws. It took nearly 20 more years of activism for it to become a crime in all 50 states, which didn't happen until 1993. To put that in perspective, there are people listening to this who were already in high school or starting their careers before the law fully recognized that no still means no, even if you have a marriage license. And even today, we are still dealing with the fallout. Some states still have loopholes where spousal rape is treated as a lesser crime than non-spousal rape, or it has different requirements for proving force. It's a perfect example of how the authority of the husband we talked about earlier didn't just disappear. It just kind of moved into fine print of our legal codes. All that being said, great. I guess we have made progress. We don't have laws anymore that literally tell us a husband owns his wife. However, we've replaced them with a system of financial penalties that target women just for existing in a female body. Maybe you've heard of it. We call it the pink tax. Think of it as the modern economic version of coverture. Instead of a husband legally absorbing your wages, the market just charges you more for the exact same products men buy. We're talking about everything from razors and deodorants to dry cleaning and even haircuts. On average, products marketed to women cost about 7 to 13% more than the male versions. But it's not just a marketing choice. In many places, it's actually backed by the state in the form of the tampon tax. Even now, around 18 plus states still treat menstrual products as luxury items rather than medical necessities. So while things like Rogaine or even some types of candy are tax exempt, women are literally paying a government mandated fee for a biological function we can't control. There's also the hidden layer of pink tariffs. A 2015 study found that import taxes on women's clothing are often significantly higher than men's. We're talking 15.1% tax on women's imported apparel versus 11.9% for men's. It's a literal government mandated fee on your gender that stays invisible because it's just bundled into the retail price. It's a subtle way of maintaining that legal cage that I talked about earlier. Back then, it was about where you lived and who you belonged to. Today, it's more like think death by 1,000 cuts, or in this case, 1,000 extra cents that keep women at a financial disadvantage. The pink tax adds up to roughly $1,400 per year in extra costs just for being a woman. So when we ask if the law treats men and women differently in the US today, it's in the receipts, literally. The fight to fix this, though, is happening. It's happening right now in Congress. The Pink Tax Repeal Act was reintroduced in May of last year. This bill would prohibit any person from selling substantially similar products or services at different prices based on gender. It would also empower the FTC to enforce this as an unfair or deceptive act. And it would allow state attorneys general to take civil action against companies that keep hiking prices for women. While it has passed in the House in the past, it's still waiting for that final push to become federal law. However, in the meantime, states like California and New York have already taken the lead by passing their own bans on gender-based pricing for goods and services. But the pink tax is only half of the story. While women are being charged more at the register, we're also being paid less at the source. And the news for 2026 is actually a major wake-up call. For the first time in over 60 years, the gender pay gap has actually widened for the second consecutive year. As of this year, women have slipped back to earning just 81 to 82 cents for every dollar a man makes. This reversal means Equal Pay Day 2026 falls even later to March 26. This symbolic date represents how far into the new year a woman must work to match what a man earned the previous year. As in, the man works January 1st through December 31st of 1 year and earns his 100%. In that same time, the woman only makes about 82%. She would need to work January 1st last year through March 26th this year just to earn her 100%. Researchers are pointing to a perfect storm of causes for this shift, including return to office mandates that have disproportionately affected women who need flexibility, as well as persistent motherhood penalty, where mothers are now paid roughly 64 cents for every dollar paid to fathers. Over a 40-year career, this gap isn't just pocket change, okay? It translates to $1 million hit to a woman's lifetime earnings. When you combine that with the pink tax, you see the real legal cage of the 21st century. It's a double bind. You earn less and you're charged more. And this financial pressure is exactly what makes our final topic so high stakes, because when the law starts regulating reproductive rights, it's not just a debate about healthcare. It's a debate about who has the financial and physical freedom to survive in a system that is already tilted against them. If the pink tax is death by 1,000 cuts to your bank account, these restrictions are about the government's direct authority over your physical body. I'm talking reproductive rights. Since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, we've moved into a reality where your fundamental rights to healthcare depend entirely on your zip code. Right now, roughly 23 million women in the U.S. live in states with abortion bans at 6 weeks or less. In these states, the law essentially mandates what happens to your physical body in a way that simply has no parallel for men, okay? There is no legal equivalent that requires a man to use his own physical organs to sustain another life. It is a uniquely gendered legal burden. That includes forcing young girls who are victims of rape to legally carry a baby to full term and birth it. There is no equivalent of this to a man. And it's not just a social issue, it's also an economic one. Recent data from the Institute for Women's Policy Research shows that abortion restrictions cost the U.S. economy an average of $173 billion per year. Billion with a B. When people are forced into births they didn't plan for, they are significantly less likely to finish school or advance in their careers, which directly feeds back into that widening wage gap we just talked about. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. You're paid less, you're charged more, and in many states, you no longer have the final say over the most significant health and financial decision of your life. Again, there is no equivalent of this to a man. When you look back at the old concept of coverture, the idea that a woman's identity is absorbed by someone else, it's hard not to see the echoes of that still here today. Whether it's a higher price on a pink razor or a state law that overrides your bodily autonomy, the message is the same. The law still treats a woman's independence as conditional. And we have to talk about who is actually making these choices. If you look at the rooms where these reproductive laws are being drafted, they are still overwhelmingly filled with men. In the year after Roe v. Wade was overturned, nearly 1,600 state legislators across the U.S. voted to pass new abortion bans on major restrictions, and the vast majority of them were male. It creates this bizarre legal disconnect. We have a system where the people with the least amount of personal skin in the game when it comes to the physical and medical risks of pregnancy are the ones with the most power to regulate it. It's a dynamic that hasn't changed much since the 1700s, men in power deciding what protections or restrictions are best for women's bodies. And the lobbying is no different. Many of the most powerful anti-abortion advocacy groups are led by men, and their political influence often hinges on maintaining these traditional patriarchal structures where women's fertility is seen as a matter of national importance or public morality rather than individual freedom. And when we talk about reproductive rights, I'm not just talking about abortion, I'm talking about the entire landscape of medical care for women. And it's here that the gender gap in lawmaking becomes a literal matter of life and death. You would think that if lawmakers were truly focused on protecting life, they would be pouring resources into medical research for mothers and babies. But the history of our legal and medical system tells us a totally different story. For decades, women were almost entirely excluded from biomedical research because lawmakers and scientists, again, mostly men, deemed their bodies too complex due to hormonal cycles. Men were treated simply as the universal human template. The turning point finally came with the NIH Revitalization Act of 1993. It was a landmark piece of legislation that finally made it a federal law to include women and minorities in clinical research funded by the NIH. Before 1993, there was no requirement to even see if a drug worked differently in a woman's body compared to a man's body. Even with that law, the complexity excuse had and still has dangerous consequences that we are still digging ourselves out of massive data holes because of it. Most drugs currently on the shelves were tested on men, so women are still frequently over-medicated. We saw this with Ambien, where women were taking doses that stayed in their systems way longer than expected, leading to a surge in morning car accidents before the FDA finally stepped in to cut their dosages in half, not until 2013. And when it comes to the newest medical breakthroughs, like the weight loss drugs everyone's talking about, women often have to wait years for clear data on how these affect them during pregnancy or lactation. And speaking of, pregnant people are still often kept at arm's length from clinical trials altogether. This means that even in 2026, most people have to take various medications during pregnancy without the same level of evidence-based data that we have for literally any other group. The legal focus has historically been so centered on the fetus that the health of the person carrying it is frequently treated as an afterthought. In fact, states with the most restrictive reproductive laws often have some of the highest maternal mortality rates and the worst outcomes for infant health. There is a measurable disconnect between the laws being passed to control reproduction and the actual funding needed to make sure mothers and babies stay healthy. When the people holding the pen don't share the physical reality of the people they're regulating, you end up with a system that prioritizes control over care. It all circles back to that same idea of coverture. Whether it's a husband having authority over his wife's home in the 1800s, or a male dominated legislator having authority over a woman's medical decisions today. The underlying assumption is that women aren't primary experts on our own lives, our own bodies, or our own bank accounts. That's what I've got for you today. I know that's a lot to unpack. And honestly, I still barely scratched the surface, but I'm hoping that we can keep the conversation going. Leave a comment wherever you listen to this podcast. Tag me on Instagram at indistinct.pod. Shoot me an email, leave a review. However you want to get into the conversation, I read everything and I love seeing your thoughts, questions, or even just your takeaways. And if you found this episode interesting, or even if just, maybe it was a little bit thought-provoking, share it with a friend. Seriously, please. Sharing helps this podcast reach more people. It helps conversation going. It helps me more than anything else in the entire world. We will chat next week. Love ya. Love you. Bye.